We're starting the next year in Likutei Moharan, and we're holding in the middle of Torah Zayin. And basically what Reb Nachman told us so far, just to summarize the beginning of it, is that we said that there's many things that are tied together, and those are Eminah and Tefillah and Eretz Yisrael, he said. Those things are all connected because Eminah is central to the power of the Tefillah going through. And then you have that's intimately connected to Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael is a place where the Tefillahs go up. So, and the whole Gulas comes from a lack of Eminah, he told us. And then he mentioned that the way to get to Eminah is through attaching to tzaddikim. Because tzaddikim, he brought a Zohar, that the Zohar says that emes and Eminah are connected together, and emes is the mashpia, which is the zer anpin, the zucher, and the Eminah is the malchus, is the makabel. So because of that, for us to have Eminah, we have to be connected to tzaddikim. And that connection to tzaddikim is going to be compared to an inyan of a husband and a wife, the inyan of a zivig. And the polar opposite of that is the zivig with the sitra achad, the zivig of the Yetzer Hara, which is when a person hears advice from people that are not tzaddikim, or rather are the opposite of tzaddikim. Because each time we were makabel from anybody, whoever we're makabel from, that's a bechin of a zivig. So when someone's makabel from someone who is on the side of Timur, then he's literally having, it's like a zivig, he compared to Chava with a nuchash. And he quoted a pusik, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. He talked about a pusik, "Vanoich in the satichus soirak," that I'm going to plant you like a vine. And he still hasn't explained it. He'll explain it in the next section. But he explains this idea of the vine is the idea of Ge'ilah, and he said that that's really connected to this idea of because the Pusik continues, Kilei Zera Emes, all of you are seed of Emes, which is indicating that idea of the Zivig with the Tzaddik. He's going to explain that more as we go on. And then he said that the mitzvah of tzitzis is something that's able to save a person from the Yetzer Hara, and from and in general from the advice of the Nuchash and from that Zivig of Timah. That's basically it. So now we're holding in the second half of Torah Zayin. So it's Torah Zayin subsection High, which is on Daf Tes in the regular Likutei Moharans. And now he's going to go into how this whole thing translates into one of the Medrushim of Rabbi Bar Chuna, as he has been doing so far in all of the Torahs. So he says like this. It says, V'zei perish, this is the explanation of the words in the Gemara, where it says, Umar Rabbi Bar Chuna, Rabbi Bar Chuna said, Umar li hahi taya, this taya told me, which taya, at least in the Perish Rashi, whenever you have this word in the Gemara, and the Perish Rashbam, they say it means a soicher, like a merchant, and they say it means a soicher Ishmaeli specifically, an Ishmaeli merchant, which is interesting because that seems rather random, because nothing in the context in those Gemuras give us the idea that we're talking about a merchant or an Arab, but it probably has to do with the fact that there was an Arabic word of that sense, that like the word taya, which meant like a merchant, and since it was an Arabic word, they said it means an Ishmaeli merchant. But you see from the Zohar, then the Zohar, the same word taya is used is used in context, and you see that it means something different in the original Aramaic, because the Zohar tells us that it means really a toyan chamoirim, or a donkey driver, in other words, someone who would lead the donkeys, which I guess it would be similar to like a taxi driver nowadays, right? That you would have this person who would lead the donkeys and lead you on the donkey and lead your peklich, your, what do you call it, your luggage or whatever, your baggage on a donkey. And that seems to be the original context. But anyway, let's just have this in mind, because I think Rav Nachman is going to quote here the the Rashbam, which the Rashbam's parish on this medrash is, he learns it means a soicher Ishmaeli, means a Ishmaeli merchant. But anyway, so Rabbi Barchona said that this certain Taya said to him, "Tu achvilach tira de Sinai. I'm going to show you the Har Sinai." Ozli, so we went. In other words, I went with him. And I saw the Hadran-law Akrava, that there was scorpions all around it, and these scorpions came in kichamre chevarti. They were standing, or rather, the word literal word is standing, but it means that their size was like the size of chamre chevarti, white donkeys. Okay, which is interesting because okay, you want to say scorpions as big as donkeys? That's interesting, but why? But how can you, like, what does it even mean to say that they're the size of white donkeys, right? Because white is not a description of size, right? So Nachman's going to go into all these things. V'shamati Baskol, and I heard a Baskol there. Shomeres, the Baskol said, "Oili shenishbati, oivai to me that I swore, achar shenishbati, and now that I swore, mi maifrali, who can annul the oath from me?" So, and the Rashbam explains there that it's talking about the idea of the fact that Hashem swore that he didn't have to be in gulas. So it's like almost like it looks like Hashem has charuta almost kiviyuchel on the gulas, and he says, "What should I do? I swore. Now there's no one that can annul it for me, right? Because what's a bezin that can annul an oath of Hashem?" So that's the push-up shot. And of course, there's many questions in that too, because what does that have to do with Har Sinai being surrounded by white donkeys or scorpions the size of white donkeys, right? So we're gonna go into all of this as Reb Nachman explains. So Nachman says like this. He takes this medrash now piece by piece. So he says Tuva achvei loch tir de Sinai, that it starts with that this Taya said to him, "Come, I'll show you the Har Sinai." Sashi bechinas aitzas, which is the idea of aitzas, of advice. Kisham kibli Taya gitim, because that's where we receive the 613 pieces of advice, which are the mitzvahs. Right, because this is what we were talking about before, that the idea of taking advice from someone is being makabel from someone. And the mitzvahs are makabel from Hashem, so it's like advice from Hashem. We said also on another level, it's also like advice because the mitzvahs are for our own benefit and for our own good. Right? It's not like we're being forced to do random, illogical things, even though some people might look at it that way. But the idea is that we're getting 613 pieces of advice on how to work on ourselves and perfect ourselves. So he says, Chazui dehadran la akrava, I saw that there were scorpions around it. So he explains, Haine, this means shiyash aitzas nuchash. This means that there's this idea of advice from the nuchash. So even though a nuchash and an akrav is not the same thing, a nuchash is a snake and an akrav is a scorpion, but we find a lot of times in connection. A lot of times Chazal mentioned the two of them in one context. Like you have the idea that the Mishnah in Bruchas goes into the Bashmona Esrei. If a snake coils around you, then you shouldn't be mafsik your Shmona Esrei. But if an akrav comes, then you should, right? And then you have the idea that by Yosef, by the bor with Yosef, it says Habor rak ein by mayim. The bor was empty. There wasn't any. The pit was empty. There wasn't any water there. And the Gemara says, well, it was empty of water, but there was snakes and scorpions, the chushim v'akrovim there. So these two are often mentioned in connection. And they're dangerous. They have a similar symbolism, a similar imagery. They're both animals. They're dangerous animals and could kill a person. So the idea is that that the Har Sinai represents the advice that's coming from Hashem, which is the good advice, which is going to be connected to the advice of a tzaddik and to a zivig of kedusha. But then around there are all these akruvim, which represent all these other places where a person can get advice from, which are from evil people, which would be the bechina of the advice of the nuchash, atzas rishuan. Shalidayam ein yecholim lekabel atzas tzadikim zero emes. That's when a person gets involved with these other forces, and he can't be makabel the advice of a tzaddik and that zivig of emes, of kedusha, which comes from the tzaddik. And then the then the Medrash says, they stood as tall as white donkeys. So he says, this goes on the idea of the tzitzis. Shehi shmira ma'atzas hanuchash, because tzitzis is a shmira, protection from the heights of the nuchash, miniyaf, and from niyaf, from sinning in sexual ways. Moshe calls Chazal right, and he brings the Gemara Menuchas, Isaiah Anshe Gudel, Shaluvana Shal Tchailas. Chazal ask over there in the Gemara, what's worse? What incurs a greater punishment? Not wearing the white strings of the tzitzis or not wearing the blue strings of the tzitzis? That's what the Gemara asks there. And they say, Mushal La'echa, they say a mushal, an allegory or a whatever, what do you call it, a parable to understand this. The Gemara over there says, mushal, let's say there was a king who commanded two people to prepare for him a choisem, which is like a seal or a stamp. And one of them he commanded to prepare a seal of gold. The other one he commanded to prepare a seal of clay. And so who's he going to be more upset at when he doesn't prepare it, right? So the answer is he's going to be more upset at the person who doesn't prepare the seal of clay, because that's much more readily available. That's much more accessible than gold, right? So the person that didn't prepare the seal of gold, he can say, well, I was looking for gold, I couldn't find gold, or I couldn't afford gold, or whatever it is. But the one who couldn't prepare the seal of clay, he'll tell him, he had no excuse. So the same way in the tzitzis, the love on the white strings of the tzitzis are very accessible. It's just wool, right? But the tchailas, we have to actually find the tchailas, which is the chaluzin, and that was also very expensive. That's a less of a problem. That's what the Gemara says over there. So he says, so that's what the Gemara says there. Now the Nachman explains. So there's going to be this idea of the white, what do you call them? The white donkeys is going to be the idea of this white tzitzis that we're supposed to wear. And he says, and that's this idea of these chamre, these chamoirim, these donkeys. This chamre is lushan choimer, betit. It's the expression of clay, because that same word choimer, which really literally means substance, right? It's connected to the word chamor, which means a donkey, but you have this word choimer in reference to clay, because clay is something that's just an unformed substance, which you then form it yourself into the shape that you want and then bake it, right? So he says this idea of these white donkeys, the white is going on the white strings of the tzitzis, and the chamri, the chamoirim, is going on the choyer, is going on clay, which is the seal of clay that the Gemara mentions. And chivra, he says white. Tiny lovan is white. Ki akshav zeh ikar tzitzis. This is nowadays the ikar tzitzis is the white tzitzis, right? Chaylas is something that we don't know for 100%. If the tchaz that they have is the actual chaylas, even though it's pretty likely, right? But it's not for sure. So the ikar void of the tzitzis today is the lovan, is the white. The Rizal says until Mashiach comes, there won't be the blue tchailas, which is one of the kashas that some of the people that don't wear tchailas, they ask on the people that do. I mean, the Rizal says until Mashiach comes, there won't be such a thing. Unless we're holding already at Mamish at the around the corner from Mashiach. So, right, but whatever. But the point, but that's what he says here. So the idea is going to be that you have these scorpions, which are the advice of the Nuchash. And immediately it mentions that they're standing like white donkeys to indicate to us that the solution to these scorpions and the way to get rid of them, the way to get rid of the advice of the Nuchash, is through the tzitzis. So he says, "V'shamati baskol." So then the Gemara continues there. They heard a baskol she'emer that said, "Oy li shenishbati, oy vay to me that I swore to put the Yidden in gulas." And he brings perish rash. He brings the perish of the Rashbam, ala gulas, on the gulas, hani al dai tzitzis, that through the tzitzis, yicholim luvoy la'atzis tzadikim, to the tzitzis we come to the advice of a tzaddik, because the tzitzis protect us from the advice of the Yetzer Hara. And then we can come to the advice of the tzaddik, the bechinas emes, which is emes, V'aldei emes buim le'amina, and through emes you come to amina. V'aldei amina, through amina bu ha'geila chanal. Then the amina is the way that we get to the geila. V'zei sheshuma charutas Hashem ala gulas. So this idea that you heard Hashem's charuta on the gulas is the idea ki atzitzis Hashem chamri chivri gurim kozeh. This the idea of tzitzis is the key to the geila, right? Because again, tzitzis connects from the Yetzer Hara, and that connects us to the tzaddik. Connected to the tzaddik, which is emes, that brings us to amina. And when we have amina, then the gulas can finish, because the whole gulas is here just because of lack of amina. The Zay Perish says this is the explanation of. We're going back to the pusik he started with. He started with the pusik, the first pusik in Parshas Mishputim. These are the laws that you have to place before them. Hashem says to Moshe. So he explains here, ve'ailei, and these, which is the first word of that pusik. So he brings the Chazal say, kol makom sheneimar ve'ailei is Moshe, in the sense that, we know that in sentence structure, if anyone remembers the rules for writing sentences, you don't start a sentence with and. You especially don't start a paragraph with and. You especially don't start a whole entire cipher with and, right? But yet the Torah does that all the time. And so what does it mean that the Pusik Parshas Mishputim starts with ve'ailei Mishputim, and these are the Mishputim? So the Chazal tells us that whenever that happens, the idea is that this is coming to include, in the sense that it says if it just says ailei by itself without the v, without the and, then that means that this is something new and that annuls everything that it says previously. You have to know what that means too. In each case, it's going to mean something slightly different. But when it says ve'ailei, that means to connect it to something additional, which is that which was stated in the parsha before. So this idea of ve'ailei over here, he says Zay b'chinas Yosef. This idea of Yosef, which Yosef is the idea of to moisef, to increase, to add on, right? That's the same lushan. And he said that's b'chinas shmiras habris. That's shmiras habris because the Yosef is Yisoid, right? And Yisoid is shmiras habris, which is connected to b'chinas tzitzis, connected to the idea of the tzitzis, like we say, because tzitzis protect the person from sinning in those ways. And then it says in the Pusik Hamishputim, right? So it says Zay b'chinas kilei zera emes. This is the idea of this advice of the tzaddikim, which is called zera emes, seed of truth. Like it says in the Pusik in Tehillim, Mishputei Hashem emes, tzadki yachdav. Right, so the idea is that Hashem's mishputim are emes. So we see that this is the bechina of being mekabel from a holy source. Shezoich la'atzis tzadikim, the bechina is emes. Then it says asher tusim lifnaihem, which you shall place before them. He says zei bechinois kad yischaber ba emes. This is like what the Zohar said. The Zohar said that when you unite emes together with tzedek, then you get a minna. So he says, Zay b'chinas hishvi ish le'ish. This is the idea that on the words Asher Tusim Lifnayim, that you should place before them. We saw at the beginning of the piece last week that you should place these mishputim before them is the idea that the Chazal say that Lifnayim is plural, right? And the idea is that this means to include both males and females in the laws of the Torah. Both men and women are mechiyev in it. So he says that this idea of hish ve'ish le'ish, that ladies and men are both equally mechiyev in these laws, is sort of showing to us a concept of zivik, because ish and ish is zivik. So this Asher Tusim Lifnayim alludes to this idea of the zivik of kedusha. And he says kizei ish ve'ish, this idea of ish and isha is haim b'chinas his chabris emes ve'amina. This is the idea of the zivik of emes and amina, or of zeranpan and nikfa, of the male and the female. It was very tuli ha'geila chanal, and the entire geila is dependent on this amina. Then also Chazal also say on this first pasuk of Parshas Mishputim, which Rashi brings down, which we saw in the beginning of the piece last week, that it says that you might have thought the Talmidim would learn and not understand. Talmud Loimar, so it comes to teach us, Asher Tusim Lifnaim, you shall place the Mishputim in front of them. like a set table, k'shulchan aruch, right? Which is the idea that these laws should be laid out in a logical, understandable sort of a way, so everyone can understand them correctly. So he says, Talmud Loimer, Erkam Lefnaim Keshulchan Aruch, Zeh Bechinas HaGila. This is the Ge'ila. Shel Usid, why is this the Ge'ila? Because he says, Shel Usid, in the future, when Mashiach comes, is Gali Kol HaChachmas Keshulchan Aruch. All of the Chachmas is going to be revealed. And it's going to be like a set table. In other words, what it means is that all the Torah, even the concealed aspects of the Torah, even Pnimis HaTorah, which nowadays we're struggling to understand it because we don't have enough experiences to understand these concepts. We're just sort of working with them like a blind person trying to talk about colors, right? But when Mashiach comes, and then all this is going to be clear, and it's not going to be a question anymore, and it's going to be very simple. So this idea of everything being laid out like a set table where everything is ready and everything's accessible and there's no difficulties is alluding to this idea of Bez Hashem when Mashiach comes. Like it says in the Pusik in Yeshaya, the world will be full of knowledge. Really, the Pusik says, Daya es Hashem. The world will be full of knowledge of Hashem. That's what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. And that's the end of Reb Nachman's words. But now it says over here, Hashmutas Hashaychim l'Torah Zois. There's some things there's other statements of Reb Nachman that are connected to this Torah, and Reb Nussin sort of compiled them and brought them down over here. That's going to be the rest of the piece. So he says, "Hatefillah bechinas aminah." So he mentioned this before, this idea that tefillah is aminah, right? V'hi bechinas hanisim, and he said before this idea of nisim, of miracles, because miracles are something that are above nature, and so too is tefillah something that's above nature, because you override nature sometimes, Bez Hashem, with the koyach of tefillah. And for this you need aminah, kanal ayin sham. So that's a quote from above. Now Nussin brings things relevant to this, and he says, "B'shvil zeh hatfillah mesigil lezechuran." This is why tefillah is a sigila for zekuran, for remembering things, for memory, right? In the sense that we have this concept that a person has a bad memory, then tefillah is a very big sigila to repair that. And the reason is, tefillah bechinas aminah kanal, because like we said, tefillah is this idea of aminah. B'shikcha, and forgetting the inyan shel lefanayni dover ma v'nishkach v'over me'etuni, and the idea of forgetting something is the idea that something was before us and we forgot about it, which really means the opposite of tefillah, because the whole idea of tefillah is that you know that Hashem is in charge and Hashem can change anything. Any type of thing that's happening, Hashem can change that at His will. So by asking Hashem, that's like the best way. That's the best solution to any problem. Okay, we have to do our own chassidus in this world too, but that's a very big idea of tefillah. Person doesn't daven, right? And that's the idea that he forgot this important point that Hashem is in charge of everything. So that's why tefillah is a sigila for remembering, and because that's the opposite of forgetting that Hashem's in control. So he says, "He derech ha'anhuga al de maruchas ha'mazulus," and this is the idea of Hashem conducting the world according to the setup of the constellations of the heavens. Shemisnag beside the yoyim achayoyim, which these constellations of the heavens are very predictable, and they have a side, they have a setup, right? And every day the sun comes up when we know it's going to come up, and it goes down at the time we know it's going to go down. Everything is a predictable system. He says, "V'hi hepech ha'aminah," and this is the opposite of aminah, because a person can see this system of nature and become very secure in it, and then just rely on nature for all of his problems, right? So if he gets sick, he's going to go to the doctor. Doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't all go. We should, of course, all go to the doctor when we feel sick, right? But the idea is that we have to also have that tefillah and that aminah. But someone doesn't have aminah, he'll just depend on the natural cycle and depend on nature, and rely on nature to help him with his problems. Masha'ayin kain, which is not so. Imam and sheyesh mechadish b'chol hakol b'ritzoynei. If a person knows there's somebody, which is Hashem, of course, who can anytime create anything new according to his will, every single day and every single minute, every single second, right? So then, and Hashem's the one that's constantly giving life to the world every second. And Hashem is higher than time and above and beyond time. Then there's no forgetting. Because since Hashem's above time, the only way a person can forget something is with time, right? Because if you just heard something a second ago, you're not going to forget it the next second, right? You need time in order to forget something. But if Hashem is above and beyond time, and on that level of Hashem, there's no idea of forgetting at all. So if someone's connected to Hashem and through davening, then he doesn't forget. Yet that's a segula for memory. So he says, now we can see an amazing thing in the words of Chazal, in the Gemara in Shabbos, where Chazal tells Mem v'samach shebelichos b'nes ha'yoimdim. It says that in the lichos, in the Seres Dibros, we know that Chazal tells that they were really carved all the way through, in the sense that there wasn't just words carved on the actual tablets, but the words were actually carved all the way through the tablets. So then, if that's the case, then there's certain letters which, and specifically he says the mem and the samech, are letters which we have a problem, because the mem, right, the mem goes around, but then there's a center section there. Or rather, he means the end of mem, the final mem, which is completely circular. So if you try to carve a tablet and you try to carve out a letter mem there, then the middle will fall out. It'll just be a hole. Right? The same thing was with the samech. So because of that, Chazal tells us that the mem and the samech and the lichas were standing there miraculously. Otherwise, that middle section would have fallen out of those letters. So he says, but we have an allusion here to the idea that we're talking about. It says ki mem samech, the oisis mem and samech, right? Which mem is gematria 40 and samech is gematria 60, so total is a gematria 100. This is the idea of forgetting. Why? I'll say Amir Rizal, because Chazal say in the Gemara Chagiga, Ein doim ashrayne pirkoi maya pumim le maya pumim ve'echad. Someone who counts, someone who learns a certain piece of Torah 100 times is not comparable to someone who learns it 101 times. And the Gemara explains over there, if you learn something 101 times, you for sure won't forget it. But 100 times, you still could forget it. So the idea is that 100 still represents the idea of forgetting. Ki mem samach v'gematria maya, because mem samach is gematria 100. Vad maya shalit hasar shel shikha. Until 100, the malach in charge of forgetting is still rules there. V'zeh shamtiki chazal mem v'samach hani mem samach she bechinas hashikha. And this mem and the samach and the lichas the chazal are talking about, this idea of 40 plus 60 is the idea of 100, which represents forgetting, represents shikha. B'nes ha'yoimdim. And this was standing with a nes. Kinesi hepecha shikha, because the nes is the opposite. The idea of a nes is the opposite of forgetting, because the idea of a nes, of something being above nature, is the idea of reminding ourselves that Hashem is in charge of everything, which is the opposite of that forgetting. So that mem and that samach, which represent forgetting, had to be oimer, had to have their kiyum through a nes, through the idea of remembering that Hashem's in charge and not forgetting that. Ki nisim ham bechinas tefillah, and nisim is the idea of tefillah. Bechinas aminah, which is aminah. Shehepech hasheicha, which is the opposite of forgetting. Kanal. V'da, you should know. Ki tzitzis shmir l'niyef. Tzitzis are protection against sexual sins. And he says, al shchem avihem, that we have that, and we mentioned this also before briefly, that it says that when Noach got drunk and he was lying naked in his tent, then Shem and Yefes, his sons, came and they brought what's it called? They brought like a cloth or like a blanket on their shoulders, and they covered their father. So he says, "Hey, bechinas tzitzis," and then the Zohar tells us this is the idea of tzitzis, this blanket, because it's a blanket for nakedness, it's a blanket for niyav. So he says, "B'zeh," and this is what it means. They went to, by the Master with Yosef, where it says, "Haloi achichu roim b'Shechem." The Yaakov told Yosef that your brothers are what's the word? Are pasturing? No, are shepherding, whatever, the sheep in Shechem, right? Because the word Shechem is the same word that was used. They had this that by Noach's sons. They had this this blanket on their shoulders, al Shechem Shnaim, on the shoulders of the two of them. And Yaakov told Yosef that your brothers are in Shechem. This is also going to represent this idea of tzitzis, sheshmir l'niyaf, which is a protection against immorality. V'hi b'chinas shmiras habris, which is the idea of shmiras habris. Shehi b'chinas Yosef, which is the b'chin of Yosef himself. So al kain Umar Yaakov Yosef. That's why Yaakov said to Yosef, "Haloi achichu roim b'Shechem." Your brothers are in Shechem. She b'chinas shalach. Yaakov told Yosef, they're there in Shechem. They're there in your level, on that level of shmiras habris, which is represented by the tzitzis, which is the very level of Yosef himself. L'chu v'eshlechu alayim. So that's why I'm going to send you to them. Yaakov said, to send you to them because they're in your territory, so to speak. So he says, this is the explanation of the pasuk that we brought before from Yirmiyah. I planted you like a vine, Hashem says to the Yidden. Because the Yidden should be mekabel the drops of intelligence which come from the tzaddik, which is the idea of zivik. Because like we mentioned, the Chazal tell us that the spiritual origin of the zera is in the brain. So when you're mekabel from a tzaddik, you're being mekabel from their intelligence, you're being mekabel from their mind. You're being kavyuchel mekabel their zera in a spiritual sense, which is the idea of zivik. And the aitzah shemekabel many, and this is through the aitzah, the advice that were mekabel from the tzaddik. V'zei soirak, and that's this idea of the soirak, which we mentioned over here, this vine. Which is he bechinas shirik, which is that the same word soirak. It's written with a sin, so it's going to be the same oisis as shirik, which is the vowel shirik, which is 3 drops. It's 3 diagonal lines, right? She tlastif, which is like these 3 drops coming out of the mind. They get the chachma and the bin and the das of the tzaddik. When she goes bizarre, like the Zohar says in the Tekinei Zohar, Hitlas Moichen, that this is the 3 aspects of the mind, aspects of the brain. Ki inyan eichel, this is all one inyan, it's all one concept. Ki atipa bua mahamoyach, because this tipa of zera, the spiritual sense, comes from the mind. Imegia leakloyas, and it comes to the kidneys, shenkali haluda, which are the vessels of procreation. Which I said that it might be that this idea of the kidneys is a kidney for the beitzim, because the physical kidneys don't really have much to do with procreation, right? Shemavash lemazeh, which they cook the zera there, they prepare the zera, they warm it up, so to speak, in order that it should be ready for zivik. Kind of cycle, so too the cycle, which is in the mind, right? It's also created in the brain. The Megia, the Kloyas Hayatzas, it also goes down to the kidneys, so to speak, because it says the word Kloyas, which means kidneys, is used of the idea of advice. The kidneys are, kidneys offer advice. So you have this expression in Tanakh. The Tlas Moichin, this idea of these 3 aspects of the mind, the Chochmah and the Das. This is the Bechina of Hashman Live, V'oznov, V'ainov. It says that this idea that the Yidden, their heart got fat, and their ears got fat, and their eyes got fat, so to speak, which is the expression of being too sated. And then they ended up sinning. It says Pen Yire Ba'ainav V'oznav Yishmav Lehuva Yuvin V'shav V'ruf Eloi. The pusik that tells us in Yeshaya, a beautiful pusik, that don't worry, these things will change, and soon we'll see again with our eyes. and hear again with our eyes. And our heart will understand, and then shav verufa, and then we'll do tshiva, and we'll have our refiah. Kloimer, this means to say, Shaina roitze ledabek atzma letzadikim, that this idea of the heart and the ears and the eyes being stopped up and fat is the idea of someone who doesn't want to listen to the tzaddikim. And this is something, a big problem that we have nowadays. Because people are very disillusioned with the tzaddikim, because of course with Yiddish Adoris, so too the tzaddikim are not the same tzaddikim that they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Right? So a lot of people have this problem, and people tend not to seek out a tzaddik's advice nowadays. But that whole idea is a big problem, right? Because it's coming from this sort of a complacency which we've gotten to, and then that sort of makes us blind and deaf, and our heart not to understand, and we don't want to accept advice from the tzaddikim. Avol, but when a person attaches to the tzaddikim and he receives the advice from the tzaddikim, which this is the idea of the kidneys of advice, which are organs of procreation, hatipa moyach, which receive those tippas that come, these drops that come from the mind, right? Mischalkes litlas tippa, which is divided into three drops, which are the chacham and the das, tlas moichin, the three parts of the brain canal. And then when that happens and we receive the eyes of the tzaddik, then Yireh b'ayna will see with her eyes, Ba'azna v'yishma will hear with our ears, Uvayuvan, and our hearts will understand, Shem b'chinas ha'gil moichin, which is connected those three moichin. In other words, he's saying that the eyes and the ears and the hearts are going to be connected to three moichin. So you know that the Rizal explains to us that that eyesight is connected chokhmah, and hearing is connected binah. And the reason is because eyesight is clear. You know, it says "Aina doim shmiya l'riyah." Hearing is not the same as seeing, or they say in the Goyish world, seeing is believing, right? So the idea is that the eyesight is the most powerful of all the senses that we have, and it's the most real, right? Even though there's also optical illusions too. We can't forget our eyesight isn't perfect, right? But compared to the hearing, it's much more powerful. But there's this famous word that okay, I just noticed the chat just now, the second. The kidneys remove toxins from the body. Oh, and someone asked what's an akrav? Akrav is a scorpion. So I'm just catching up all this old stuff. I just noticed the chat now. Sorry. To where the tit is outside is, well, basically the idea that the Arizal really says where the tit is inside, believe it or not. Because the Arizal says that the talis gudel, the talis that goes over us, is a kind of an or makiv, which is outside, and the tzitzis is or pnimis, that should really be inside. So the chassidim, where the tzitzis outside, should at least wear something over the tzitzis, like a vest, because then it's not outside. It's sort of like in between, right? And then it's still considered or pnimi. Right. So that's the answer to that. But it's good to have that. But I guess at least to have the strings visible, right? This idea that you remind yourself of the tzitzis and you have them in mind, and that is a shmira against niyuf, right? Because if you forget you have them, it's not going to help you much. So yeah. So anyway. So we were saying. Oh yeah, strings outside is for sure okay, Alpi there is. Yeah, it's only the idea that the idea is that the tzitzis shouldn't be the beged elyoin. That's the idea. So it should be at least covered with something. I'm not saying I'm so makbar on this myself all the time either. I mean, I try to be, but whatever. Anyway. So yeah. So back to our ideas over here. So the idea of receiving. So this idea is that the person's heart and so he said that the eyes and the ears and the heart are going to be the three moichet, the chachma bin and the das. So basically, the idea is that re'iyah is chachma and shmiya is bina, and the lev which is going to be the Bechina of the Das, and because it's below the other two, right? And the idea of so I was just going to say that this is famous words from I think it's from the Guru, from the Vilna Gaon, I think. His idea that it says in the Gemara, when the Gemara wants to bring a proof for something, the Gemara says, Tu Shma, come and hear. When the Zohar Kodesh wants to bring a proof for something, it says, Tu Chazi, come and see. Right? And so there's this whole word that's because Pnimis Torah is a higher level. So because of that over there, we're on the level of Riyah already, on the level of Chachma. Whereas in Nicholas Torah, of course, it's still a very high level, and everyone knows that we have to have a lot of understanding to grasp the Gemara too. But that's a slightly lower level, so over there it's on the level of Shmiya, on the level of hearing. But anyway, so that's the idea over here that the Yishai is telling us that in the hearts, when the eyes were able to see and the ears were able to hear and the heart were able to understand, this idea of the moichin, of these three moichin, which is the idea of this zera, or this energy that's coming from the moyach of the tzaddik that we're connecting to. And then it says v'shav v'rufaloi, and then you will do tshiva and we'll have a refiah. Zayin, and that's what it means. That's what the pusik means. I planted you like a vine, just totally seed of truth. It's going to be that the idea of the soirak is the idea of the shirik, which is the three dots, which represents those three drops from the chokhmah, bina, and das of the mind, which is the idea of the zivig with the tzaddik. So you're being mekabel the zera emes, the zera of the zucher of the tzaddik, which is called emes, which represents zucher, which represents their anpin. So you're makabel, so you're in that context going to be the bechinas in the kaiva, in that context. So he says zay perish, and this is the perish in the medrash that we quoted. Umar Rabba Barchona, zay reim is gamkain, Pesach Dvurav. This is also alluded to in the beginning of the words, in the sense that Rebbe Nachman, at least in the piece where we went over the medrash Rabba Barchona, he only mentioned the idea that the Har Sinai symbolizes the zivig with the tzaddik, right? And the being makabel, the aitzas of Kedisha, and the scorpions around there represent the idea of aitzas Rishuim. And that's all he told us. But over here now, as is also alluded to in the beginning of the Gemara, when it says Umar li hahitaya, that this taya spoke to me, which you mentioned that at least I'll be the context you see in the Zohar, taya means a donkey driver, right? But the way that the Rishonim explained, the Rashi and the Rashbam and others, is that it means a soicher Ishmaeli, and Ishmaeli, Arab merchant. So he says perish Rash. He brings the perish with the Rashbam. B'chol mukam, at every place where you find the word taya, it means soicher Ishmuel. It means Arab soicher, Arab merchant. Ki Yishmuel. So what's the side of that? Because Ki Yishmuel, he bechinas tefillah, because Yishmuel is tefillah, because the very idea of it, the very word, Yishma Kail, that Hashem will hear, right? It's the idea of Hashem hearing our tefillahs. Because like it says in the Pusik, Kishma Hashem al Yechu, that says that over there when Hagar was thrown out by Surai, it says that I think it's the Malach told her that Hashem heard your cry, Hashem heard your suffering. And v'targimoi, and then the targum of that is Arai kibel Hashem etzloischu, and Hashem received your etzloisach. Hashem received your tefillah. The idea is that we see over here that this idea of hearing is the idea of tefillah. He bechinas amina kanal. This is the idea of amina that we talked about. And then there's a pusik that says in Tehillim, your amina is a circle, it's a protective shield around you. V'zehi, and that's what also it means in Sefer Riz, which says Parashta knefechu ala musechu, where Riz came over to Boaz when Boaz was when Boaz was sleeping over there in the gurin, in the threshing floor, and she came over there and she lay down at his feet, and then she told him, cover what's it called? Take your knaf, take the corner of your garment, and put it over your maidservant. The idea being that she was asking Boaz to take her, to take her in marriage, right? So the idea is, and the word knaf, of course, is also which means the corner of your garment, right? It's also connected to the tzitzis, of course, right? So it says ki tzitzis the kedusha, the tzitzis of the kedusha, shem kanfei mitzvah, they're the corners of mitzvah. Is shmiras abris, which is the idea of shmiras abris. He bechanas zivig the kedusha, is the idea of zivig of kedusha, which is really what Ris wanted. Ris wanted that Boaz should take her, and they should have this holy zivig, and Taka from that came out over the Melech, right? So he says, "V'zei sheshul Haggai Haggai Hanovi." This is what Haggai Hanovi asked, where he asked, "Hain Yisu ish busar kodesh beknaf bigdoi v'nuga bekanfo al aleichem." The idea over there is that Haggai was trying to faher the kahanim to make sure they knew the halachas of Tima and Tahara. And he said, and he gives an example there. What if you had a person who had busar kodesh, had a piece of meat from the karbunas in the corner of his baget, the corner of his cloak, and then he touched, and I think that became tumah. The busar became tumah. I think. Yeah. No, forget the baget became tumah. So he was holding a busar kodesh, holding meat in a baget, and then this baget touched something that was makabel tumah, like touched a sheretz, let's say, right? And then this piece of meat eventually got out of the baget and touched a piece of bread. Is that piece of bread now tumah or not? That was a question basically that he was asking the kohanim. But he explained that Nachman says on a slightly deeper level. Says because the inyan of the busar is going to refer to pagama bris, because the bris is busar kodesh, right? And then if that touches a sheretz, so to speak, is the idea of a person being defiled, and defiling is makam bris. And then that touches the lechem, that touches bread. He explains that means ki pagama bris heder lechem, that the idea of pagama bris takes away from a person's bread, takes away from a person's mezainis, takes away from a person's parnusa. Like it says in the Pusik in Mishle, Ba'ad Isha Zoyna Ad Kekalechem. The Pusik in Mishle literally is referring to the fact of how silly people are, that they're so addicted to their Yetzaharas that someone's willing to sell his last piece of bread, for a immoral pleasure, for a Zoyna. But the idea is going to be that the Nachman connects it to this idea that he's talking about. And he says that when a person sins in this way, he loses his last piece of bread, unfortunately. He loses his parnusa because of this avaira. And push it, I think we can say that the idea is that lechem is 3 times havaya, right? The Arizal tells us in the kavunas of moitzi lechem in the uretz. And 3 times havaya, of course, is going to represent 3 different spheres, 3 different levels. That represents the moichin, right? And the moichin is the zera comes from the moichin, right? So when a person is moitzi zera levatula, then that draws away from those moichin, which are lechem, which are his source of sustenance, and he doesn't have that source of sustenance. I hope and understand this, he says. Then he quotes another pusik at the end of Breshis, in when Yaakov was giving all the bruchas before he passed away. It says of Vetushev ba'aisan kashtoi, he will put his kashas, his bow and arrow, in strength, which of course alludes to the idea of Shmiras Habris, because that Chazal tell us that the Zera shoots out of the Mokum Bris like an arrow shooting out of a bow, right? So that's an allusion to that. And it says Misham Roya Avon Yisruel, and from there is the shepherd, the Roya, the Avon Yisrael, the rock of Yisrael. And Chazal darshan that this Avon Yisrael, what does it mean Avon Yisrael? It's a very unusual concept. You don't usually see that term used in reference to Yisrael. So it explains that Avon, the Chazal say that Avon is an Traikin, it's a short form for Avuha Nivnin, fathers and sons, or Av and Ben, right? The word Avon is Av and Ben. That's the idea of fathers and sons. Bechinas Hatfila, the idea of Tfila, Yaakov Ivuna, of Yaakov and his sons. Because basically the idea is that there's the idea of the father and the son connecting, right? And the father and son connect through speaking to each other, connecting to each other, and having deep discussions with each other, right? So that's also going to be the idea of tefillah, because tefillah is the idea of talking to our Father, Kivyuchel, talking to Hashem, right? So this is all going to be connected. This idea of Shmir Sabris is going to connect the union of tefillah and the union of the minna in all these ways, like we explained throughout the Torah. And then he says another interesting thing. Segila lechoyle. There's a segila if someone's sick. They tackle tzitzis. They should look at the tzitzis. It's a segila for having a refuah from an illness. It says v'hasoid b'pusik, and that's the side of the pusik where it says in what's it called, Sefer Brashis, your son Yosef has come to you, which it says by Yaakov and Yosef. Because all these words in this pusik, correspond to the tzitzis. The Haina, in which way? Minyan achita, the amount of string, number of strings. Achilius, the amount of the knots, or the wrappings around between the knots. Vakashurim, and the knots themselves in the tzitzis. Which is as it's explained in Priyat Chaim. We don't have time to go into it now, but the idea is that the gematria of these different words over here in this pusik, over there in Priyat Chaim, and Shar Kamunas is brought down too, I think. Maybe just in Priyat Chaim, I'm not sure, but anyway, but over there it brings down the idea about how all of these words in the pusik are remiss to how the tzitzis should be organized. The idea of the number of knots, the number of strings, the number of times that it goes around, all these different concepts are alluded to over there. But anyway, so this pusik alludes to the tzitzis. V'zehi, he says, and that is what this means. Your son Yosef has come to you. Which is referring to the tzitzis. That is Chazak Yisrael. That was Mechazak Yisrael, right? So Yisrael, Yaakov was ill, and then when he heard Yosef was coming to him, Yischazak Yisrael, he had a chizik and he was able to sit up, right? That's what it tells us there. So the idea is that you see, and Yosef is the Bechinas tzitzis, and all those psikim over, and all the words in the pusik there allude to the tzitzis. So over here you see this idea that there's a segila for someone who's ill to look at the tzitzis. And that's the end of Torah Zayin. Okay, so I think we're gonna stop now. I'm gonna go to Mariv, and the Bez Hashem we're gonna be continuing tomorrow the Shir and Siv Sechain. So good night, everyone. Kol Tov, have a wonderful rest of the week, and see you soon, Bez Hashem. Kol Tov.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Kol Tov.